generally, the budget is a year-round enterprise. We typically have 3 budgets going at any given time. We'll be auditing last year's budget, managing this year's budget, and preparing for next year's budget. So here we are in April, getting ready for the May 20 town meeting to vote on the budget that will start July 1st. And I think with that, we'll dive straight into the overview, starting with, I think, some context. These slides should look familiar to members of the Finance Committee who participated in the 6-month-long Budget Conference Committee process. Part of what we did during that process was try to put Danvers' financial situation in context. The first 2 slides tonight show a 10-year snapshot in terms of revenues and expenditures, where we were versus where we are. You don't have to look too hard. This slide is essentially the same, and I think the story there in Danvers is true for most towns in cities in Massachusetts. We are heavily reliant on the property tax in this part of the country. 3/4 of our revenue in 2015 came from the property tax, and 3/4 of our revenue today comes from the property tax. There's very little movement across the other categories. You can see that state aid as a percent of budget was 10% 10 years ago, and it is 11% today. Local receipts was 13% 10 years ago, and is actually smaller as a percent of our budget now, and that includes the trash fee that we discussed most of last year. So even with the trash fee included, our local receipts is smaller as a percent of our total revenue picture than it was a decade ago. And I should note here throughout the presentation, I'll reference the page number in your budget books that you hopefully all have as we move through. Putting the property tax levy into context, this is another slide from our Budget Conference Committee workshop process. The town of Danvers is at its levy limit, but we are one of a few communities that have never passed a budget override or attempted a budget override. And our property tax bill within our region is objectively, it's in the lower third. Part of that is due to the fact that we have a robust commercial base in Danvers. Part of it is also certainly due to the fact that the town has operated within a fiscally conservative framework for many, many decades. So this is the current year average property tax bill at $7,400. Comes in again in the lower third within our region. And looking at some of that information, same information in a slightly different context. This is a slide that we pulled together as part of the Budget Conference Committee process as well. When you look across the sub-region and you total up the average single-family tax bill across each of these communities, the average electric bill across each of these communities, and the average water sewer bill across each of these communities, the all-in cost to live in Danvers, I mean, obviously we're missing some odds and ends here in terms of permits you might pull or the new trash fee. But we're just under $11,000 all in is the cost to live in Danvers, and that's the lowest you're going to find in our sub-region except for Peabody, and Peabody's state aid number is about 80% higher than Danvers. They get about $41 million a year in state aid based on their demographic and socioeconomic position. We get about $12 million a year. Median income, if you look at the bottom table, the tax bill is larger than it was a decade ago, but it represents less as a percent of median income than it did a decade ago. In other words, families in Danvers today are spending less of their total budget on their property taxes than they were 10 years ago, and that's borne out in the Division of Local Services website showing the town's relative average tax bill ranked against the state. So 10 years ago we were 102, and we've slid down to 116 in terms of our average tax bill. So that's context for the budget that we're going to talk about. On the expenditure side, it's a similar story to the revenue. Really, there are only 3 budget areas in our budget that have grown as a percent of spend in the past decade. I'm including the Danvers Public Schools in that, even though it's only up 0.3%. It represented 41.2% of our budget spend a decade ago. It's up to 41.5%. I will point out that that does not include a little less than $5 million that we budgeted in our DPW budget to support the school buildings and custodial services and things like that. It also doesn't include some of the dollars that are in our benefits budget to support healthcare. But if you break the budget book down, that is the only area outside of retirement or our Essex Tech assessment that has grown in the past 10 years. Essex Tech is up from 2.2 to 3.4%, and retirement as a percent of spend is up from 5.3 to 7.7, meaning everything else, library, general government, which includes town hall, police, fire, recreation, et cetera, as well as the benefits budget are down as a percent of spend from where they were 10 years ago. As we were working on the FY25 budget, you'll see some familiar friends here on the screen. Many of these drivers impact the town each year. The trash and recycling number at the top of the screen, that was an impact from 23 to 24, but that impact in the trash contract is essentially offset by the trash fee that was adopted by the select board in the fall. In other words, the cost increase in trash and solid waste services from 23 to 25 is offset by the trash fee, which essentially holds other departments and divisions harmless, which was one of the stated goals of the major boards during the budget committee conference, is that they didn't want to see the increased cost in trash have a negative impact on library or police or fire or any of the other departments. Retirement contribution, up again 8% this year. That's our amortized cost. We'll see a similar increase every year from now until that's fully funded in 2036, 2035. The school increase this year is $3.1 million, and I want to pause and note that healthcare and Essex Tech came in below trend and below target, which we'll talk in a minute. One of the themes in the budget this year is risk, in terms of how much risk we're willing to accept. And I want to call out Essex Tech and healthcare. We'll talk more about this during the benefits budget, but 4.57% is actually a very competitive number given the landscape today across GIC communities, which is the state's health program, as well as other Maya communities, which Danvers participates in. And our assessment from Essex Tech this year is essentially flat. Our student population didn't increase. I described that as a stay of execution at the select board budget, because had we seen a similar increase to years past at 8 to 10%, we would have been in a very difficult position going into the budget process this year. Here's another holdover from the budget conference committee process. Really, this is taking that expenditure pie chart and instead of breaking it out by service area, we're looking at it by category. And the takeaway here is that between wages, benefits, overtime, or people, which is 74 cents out of every dollar we spend, and contracted services for things like peer review in our planning department or contracted custodial services, which represents another 5 cents of every dollar we spend. We're spending close to 80 cents of every dollar in our budget on people providing services or contracted services, extending the reach of those people providing services. Around 19 cents of every dollar is spent on things like debt service, Essex Tech assessment, statutorily required special education services, insurance, et cetera. And there's really about 2 cents of every dollar left for what we would quote unquote call discretionary items, office supplies, books and materials, and things of that nature. This is another slide we see each year. We have a comprehensive set of financial policies that we want to, they provide the guardrails for us that we try to stay within. We had a historically high free cash number this year, which required a little bit of context setting the select board, and we'll do the same now. You'll recall, and we'll hear more during the warrant review process, the town took on the landfill soil project where we were taking in, I think Stephen King didn't want us to call it clean soil. He said non-impacted soil. So essentially we got permission from the DP to bring soil in from projects around the North Shore communities, and we essentially, they pay us to put that in our landfill. And we borrowed $4.5 million last year to get that project up and running. So $3.5 million of the certified free cash this year is receipts related to that project, which is going to be used to offset the debt that we incurred to start that project. So that is counted as free cash, but really it is part of a debt obligation that the town has. We also have $1.7 million in interest earnings this year, which are reflected in the free cash number. That's a historically high number, and I'll tip the hat that I'm not wearing to Jill Summit, our treasurer collector on the other side of the room, who oversees the town's investments and tracks that. That is the most volatile revenue category that we have. I think we were looking, we've missed our target there 5 of the past 10 years. And so that's not a revenue number that we chase. When we exceed it, it's a benefit to free cash. When we don't, it doesn't negatively impact the budget. So when you back out those two items alone, we're back closer to about a $7 million free cash number, which is where we expected to be based on the changes we made to some of our local receipt projections last year. And at the end of this process, you'll see that by the time we've paid for buildings improvements, reserves, capital outlay, grounds, we'll have about $55,000 of free cash left above our 1% policy. So that $12 million jumps off the page, but when you back off the obligations baked into it and you think about the town meeting warrant that's coming up, we're essentially where we always are, which is using that free cash to fund the areas that we cannot fund through the property tax levy. As part of the budget process this year, you'll see on the screen, these are the goals that the select board set out as we started the budget. One was to work with the schools to find a way to implement special education programming to try to bring some of our students back or prevent more students from leaving. You'll hear from Superintendent Bauer tomorrow night as part of his presentation, where he'll talk about some of the ways that they were able to address that. The second goal was to absorb the new CBAs, the collective bargaining agreements, into the budget in a way that fairly compensates employees but also maintains service level and budget solvency. Negotiations are ongoing with all of the town and school unions as we speak. But I also put on the screen here that we completed in the fall a comp and class study for our 70 or so management non-union positions. And that study was looking at all of the market ranges for these positions after the inflationary period that we saw, which hit between 21 and 22. And the average adjustment that was required to bring those positions in line with the market at the 75th percentile for their respective positions was just under 3%. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We're looking at each employee group as we go with each of the unions to make sure that we're where we want to be in terms of being competitive. But it's not as simple as looking at inflation and assuming that that is the answer to the question. So it's a very case-by-case approach. And one of the themes you'll see in the budget tonight is we carried a number last year in the department head's budget, which is gone, and that number was used to fund the adjustments that were required across all of the departments and divisions. So a consistent theme you'll see on the presentations tonight is that salary and line items are increasing in our smaller department and division budgets. It's fully offset by a reduction in the department head budget, which is how we implemented the results that came out of that study. And then the last goal had to do with incorporating some of the annual costs associated with the technology investments that were made, especially using ARPA. We used a significant portion of our ARPA to modernize the town's financial software platform. We were using a very outdated Windows-based admins product, and we're moving to Munis to integrate with our electric and integrate with all of our departments and divisions. We upgraded the website using some of the ARPA funds. And we're still in the process of implementing an enterprise-wide online permitting platform so that people doing business with the town are looking at the same interface regardless of the department that they're working with, and that entities who do business across the region are seeing a familiar program rather than having to come in and fill out paper-based permits to do routine work, which is how a lot of our departments were operating up until a couple years ago. At a very high level, this is what the budget looks like. Again, the biggest increase here is in the schools budget, and we'll hear tomorrow night from Superintendent Bauer what that investment includes. We have a reduction in debt service, which is helpful, and again, the Essex Tech budget and the benefits budgets came in below trend. But I'll note, and I'll credit to the department heads that you're going to see throughout the week, even with the advantageous health renewal, even with the lower than expected Essex Tech assessment, we still had and including the $1.3 million trash fee, departments still had to cut about $750,000 out of their initial budgets to get us to a balanced budget. That included the schools, the library, our town departments and divisions. So one of the other themes you'll see throughout the night and the week is that where we could, we've either level funded or even reduced some of the operating budgets to try to make that possible. And so that was the expenditure snapshot. On the revenue side, you'll see The 2.97 million includes our normal 2.5% levy increase along with our new growth projection. After a large increase in state aid last year, driven by the governor's promise to fund the Student Opportunity Act, we're at less than a 1% increase in state aid this year. And the increase in local receipts, specifically the fees line, that's where the trash fee appears. But you'll note that we've also increased a number of our other local receipts back to our pre-pandemic levels, which is supported by trend. But as we discussed last year, every dollar that we increase our local receipts is a dollar less free cash that we have certified at the end of the year. So that's the risk. So we'll touch on a few things throughout the week as we look at these budgets in terms of where we've taken a little bit more risk on in our budgeting this year to make this work. This is the first example of that, where we're pushing some of these non-tax revenues back to where they were pre-pandemic, which again we think is supported by the trend, but hurts our year-end position going into FY26. And I would be happy to pause there and take any questions about any of the items I just presented.
Any generalized questions before we move into the specific budgets?
Okay, the first budget we'll talk about is the management budget. That's on page 25 in your budget books. This is the operating budget that supports the manager's office. The salary and wages here support Ann Freitas and Judy Smith, the executive secretary of the town manager, and our purchasing specialist for the town. And you'll see there's a slight decrease in the operating expense, and as I noted a few minutes ago, the wage adjustments here are driven by the outcome of the comp and class study. Be happy to answer any questions you have about the management budget.
Arthur?
No, I'm all set.
Eric?
Nothing.
Paul?
All set.
Ted? Aaron?
All set.
Wally? Any questions from the audience? Is there a motion?
I'll move the budget.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Next on page 29 is the department head budget. Again, this is where you'll see we were carrying around $140,000 in this budget last year to implement any potential changes resulting from the comp and class study. So that is why the budget is decreasing this year. It's the same number of positions, but that carry is gone. It's been distributed across each of the departments where we saw corresponding adjustments. Happy to take any questions about the department head budget.
Wally? Aaron?
All set.
Ted? Paul?
All set.
Eric?
Just a quick question. Can you just repeat how you achieved those savings? My question really revolves around diminished services, or is that just increased efficiency?
So we were carrying, I'm going to call it a plug for lack of a better budgeting term. We knew that the town got a grant to do a comp and class study for the 70 or so non-union employees, and we needed a department to put funds to implement that project when it was complete. This happened to be the budget where we put that, so we were carrying an extra 140 here last year. So it's a net decrease of 90. So there are funds in place to once the select board finishes the evaluation process, and I finish the evaluation process for the management team, there's still appropriate funds here to give people cost of living and merit adjustments.
Arthur?
All set.
Questions from the audience? Go ahead. Mr. Bates?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bill Bates, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 4. I did a little bit of homework on the overall budgets, and I'm a little concerned with sustainability. We got, I think it's important to note that last year's department head budget was up 14.14%. So even though we're happy to see this year be down a little, last year we got whacked with, like I say, a 14.5% increase. So I guess what my comment is to the Finance Committee, in ranking these, the increases as we go by department are scary. Some of them, the highest one will be information technologies at 30% increase. town clerk, 11, veteran services, 9, treasurer collector, 8, human resources, 7, inspectional services, 7, education, 6. And I guess what I'm saying is, we've got to be careful that it's sustainable. And I'm just worried about the taxpayers' ability to pay the bills. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Take a motion.
Move the budget.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you.
If I could try to allay Bill's fears just a little bit, I bought back several slides to kind of, when you go division by division, there is a lot of volatility, but when you look at the overall budget, the general government budget is up 3.38%, library 2.8%, retirement, that's on track with trend over the last decade or so. Really, the schools is where we're seeing an increase, and that's not unintentional, and I think we'll hear tomorrow night kind of why and how and where Dan and his team were trying to be strategic, so hoping that some of that investment will pay dividends in a couple of years if we can see some of those special ed numbers start to come back down. We share the concern, Bill. Next, page 23 in our budget is the legal counsel budget. It's on, as I just said, page 23. And a quick note here, so we include in the slide here, this is the total that we budget for legal across our enterprise funds. We spend less than $100,000 a year on legal services in the town, far less than it would cost to have an in-house general counsel. I also think we have a long-standing relationship with Murphy, Hesse, Toomey, Lehane. It's a large firm, so we have access to attorneys with any specialty that we might need, whether it be tax, title, labor law, you name it. They have somebody, and if they don't, they're happy to refer us out. The electric department does have a relationship with KP Law because their legal framework is different enough from the general government work that it makes sense for them to have their own representative. But we budget that and share with each of the enterprises. Rodney works with Angelica, our business manager, and we appropriately budget in each of those departments the amount based on trend and ongoing work that they need. But for the town side, we budget $99,000 for our legal services. Happy to take any questions.
Arthur?
All set.
Nothing.
Eric?
All set.
Ted? Aaron?
All set.
Mike?
Nope.
Welcome. Great. Any questions from the audience?
Where in the budget book is page 23?
It's between 22 and 24, but
Bill, the number is actually really, really close to the spiral binding, but it looks like this, which I realized looks like every other page of
It's
the budget.
above 24, Bill.
and it's at the narrative is at the bottom of the page, on page 23, and then
Right here.
Look above.
Look above. Thank you. Appreciate that.
I understand that the weight of the entire town meeting is on your shoulders here tonight, so we're happy to take those kinds of questions. And having solved that mystery, is there a motion to move the budget?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Remaining on page 24
Slash 23.
and 23.
Moderator and select board budgets, the only increase here is related to an increase in the membership dues related to the MMA. Otherwise, these are level funded. Happy to take questions.
Why don't we take questions together on the select board and moderator budgets? We'll have to take the votes separately. But any questions from anyone?
When was the last time that we did a sort of an adjustment with the select board, and how do we rate in comparison to other communities?
We adjusted the select board and the moderator in FY '22, and that was based on a survey of like communities.
Questions from the audience? Is there a motion on the moderator budget?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The select board budget, is there a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Next, also on page 23, is the Finance Committee Reserve budget. This has not been adjusted in a number of years. You'll see that it is used from time to time. If you look at the history here, we've had to use this fund to make end-of-year budget transfers. I feel like I mention this every year, but the amount that a community can set aside in FinCom reserve is set by statute based on the size of the budget. In Danvers, statutorily, we could set aside millions of dollars. That's never been the case. We've typically used this fund for small adjustments that that were not projected at the time of town meeting. Otherwise, we would have done budget transfers at town meeting. But this gives the Finance Committee the flexibility to transfer funds typically in June, where the alternative would be to reconvene town meeting to make a minor budget adjustment. This gives Finance Committee the ability to let town meeting start their summer without having to worry about a quorum. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions?
We don't anticipate anything, I think the last 2 years we have had to make transfers, right? We don't anticipate anything this year, 2 out of 3?
We didn't in '23, and Rodney is saying, classic answer, not at this time,
Not
Mr.
okay.
Landers, not at this time.
And as I'm recalling, we used to budget a slightly higher amount, and we dropped that down maybe a couple of years ago, is that correct?
It's fluctuated. I think when I got here, it was at 75,000. I think we've had it as high as 200,000. I think during the COVID budget, we dropped it down.
Yeah.
So this has been a steady number, but it certainly could be adjusted.
Bill, you all set? Great. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you.
Human Resources budget. We have HR Director Philippe Hippolyte in the room. The murderers row back there, the heavy hitters. And we're on page 37 in the, it's been a long 2 weeks, so if my humor doesn't land tonight, you can blame the lack of sleep. Yeah, I don't know, I don't like the way this, thank you for the feedback. I'm gonna pivot. HR budget, similar story. We had some adjustments that were made as part of the comp and class study. We also promoted one of our employees last year who was an HR generalist to assistant HR director, Giuliani Vittini. That was part of the discussion last year. That happened this year. There's a slight reduction in the operating budget, but essentially the story here is coming out of the comp and class study. We made some adjustments, and we would be happy to take questions on the HR budget.
Wally? Mike?
No.
Aaron?
No.
Ted? Paul?
A general question. Not particularly about this particular budget, but I wanted to ask this question anyway, a few budgets ago. When you were talking about where we are with the levy, et cetera, and how close we are. And we're within everything at this particular point. But even when we make changes to the operating budget, which we've made many changes, obviously, doesn't appear on any of these departments that we're cutting people at all. Is that a fair statement to make?
Yeah, we have not, that is a fair statement. Yeah, we avoided layoffs during the pandemic, and this budget certainly, now, the departments would tell you there are positions that are requested that don't end up in the budget. Most of those positions are more than justified based on work orders and workload and demands for service, but we are and have been very judicious in how we approach and approve those position requests.
Thank you.
Nothing from the audience? Is there a motion?
So moved. Go ahead, Arthur. Move the budget.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you.
Next budget is town clerk, page 39 in the budget book. Our town clerk, Kathy Ellsworth, is in the audience. And similar theme here. Sorry?
That was a much better introduction.
No murders row this time. Adjustments were made based on the comp and class study. And there is an increase in the operating expenses here, and that is driven entirely by election cycle and the number of elections that we have. And I or Kathy would be happy to take any questions that you have about the town clerk budget.
Arthur?
Nope, I'm all set.
Eric?
Nope.
Paul?
All set.
Ted?
What's the customer service rep? .79.
customer service rep is formerly known as the receptionist.
Oh, okay.
So they changed that to customer service rep so that she could do more than, she does more than just answer the phone in the lobby. So she's in the office and out at the front desk.
Dog licenses? Is that-
She does handle the dog licenses primarily, which are in process, I might add.
Great plug to remind everyone to go get their dog
Yes,
licenses
that would be
renewed.
good.
Kathy, thank you for all your hard work.
Welcome, thank you.
I've lost track of,
Oh,
Oh,
no
Amber.
questions.
Mike?
Nope, great budget.
I'm good, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Bill, you all set? Okay. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Next is the accounting budget, page 31 in your budget book. And really, the story here, we are off-cycle with our actuarial study, so we're looking at essentially a level-funded budget in accounting this year, but we'd be happy to take questions that you have about this budget.
Wally? Mike?
Nope.
Aaron?
No questions.
Ted?
Nope.
Paul?
All set.
Eric?
All set.
Arthur? Sorry, Jill, I got nothing either. Bill? Okay. Is there a motion?
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Bless you.
Next is assessing. Our Chief Assessor, John LaBelle, is in the audience. And again, broken record, but we have a slight increase in the salary and wages, and we're seeing a decrease here in operating expenses. Again, that's cyclical. There is an increase here related to the upgrade of our CAMA software, which is the backbone that John relies on in determining valuations for properties in Danvers. We're on page 33 in the budget, and we would be happy to answer questions.
Arthur?
All set.
Eric?
All set.
Paul?
I have one question. The department description, it says, down number 3, managing the defense of all valuation cases at the appellate tax board to minimize the town's negative exposure to potential liability and minimize impact on the overlay.
You looking for a translation?
Yes.
So not everybody in town is, go ahead, John. Not everybody's happy with their tax bill, and it's this guy's job to navigate that process.
Yeah, some people don't like their valuations, so every January they get to challenge those. And that goes to, before my board, the Board of Assessors. And if we decline their appeal, they can appeal to the state. That's usually, occasionally it's done by residents, but it's mostly done by commercial and industrial properties. So that's, our overlay account is kind of our little side fund to cover any losses that we might get while we're at the ATB.
Okay, thank you.
Okay?
Anything else? No? Great. Is there a motion?
I'll move the budget.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Now it's Jill's turn.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right.
Treasurer Collector, page 35 in the budget books. There's an increase here, again, related to the implementation of the comp and class study. We also, Jill's assistant, Nick Navin, has taken on some assistant finance director duties and is supporting Rodney with some of the budget and analysis-related work that we have a need for. And so he's doing well taking on both of those roles. The operating budget is essentially flat, and we would be happy to answer questions about the treasurer collector budget.
Wally? Mike?
Nope.
Aaron?
No.
Ted? Paul?
Nothing?
Eric?
I do have one question, and that is the management of portfolio, just looking at market forces, et cetera, what impact concerns, it's not really a budget question, but it is more managing the dollars and what trends you see for us to weather or be concerned about. If that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I'm just go by the interest rates right now are really high. That's why we're able to, the investment income is really high right now. We don't know what the future holds. I I guess we just kind of, you know, meet regularly with our, twice a year, we meet with our
Okay.
investment company. We met with them actually today. And then just have a good relationship with the banks that we have our money in.
Follow up, do we have a standing strategy, you know, and meeting twice a year? I would imagine they have marching orders on how aggressive you want them to be and just kind of keep an eye on things.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so for the actual investment, like the manager had mentioned, related to revenue for the operating budget, as Jill mentioned, that's mostly in a cash-ready account, so it's really driven by the interest rate. In terms of investing for like our OPEB trust fund, right now we're about a 65-35 split between equity and bonds, but we're looking to potentially adjust that in the near future, upwards in the equity side, but.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Arthur?
All set.
Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thanks, Jill.
Next is our debt service, which is on page 83 in the budget books. And you'll note that our overall debt posture is declining this year. We're reducing slightly our reliance on the debt stabilization, which is part of our planned use of that fund. You can see on the pie chart on page 83, roughly 80% of the town's debt is related to school projects. That's pretty standard across most communities. We do have some debt on the horizon. Nothing is solid yet, but we've been working for a couple of years with a committee to look at our options for our public works facility, which is spread across 3 or 4 different sites right now. We're pretty limited in options. The state has given us the right of first refusal on the old power plant property up at the base of the old state hospital. The state is doing some remedial work. They're removing the structures there and doing the environmental cleanup on that work. And then we'll go through an appraisal process with the state, and we'll have the option to buy, should we choose. That's probably still a couple years out. Also, when we talk,
Is that the one over by the rail trail?
the proposed rail trail, yeah. Runs parallel to Maple, yeah, accessed off Maple Street. Yeah. The town has an existing utility easement there. And we will talk as part of the landfill project during the warrant review. When we took that project on several years ago, that project is really the precursor to putting in a 1.2 to 1.5 megawatt solar array at the landfill. But the revenue that is generated off that project beyond the cost, the select board discussed recommending rolling those funds into the debt stabilization fund to both replenish that fund, but also position the town for its next debt project, whether it is the landfill project or the next, the DPW project or the next school project, which is always around the corner. Happy to take questions on this budget.
Wally?
No, I'm good for now.
Mike?
What percentage of our debt is in, I guess, sort of traditional municipal loan type loans, and what percentage of it is in what sort of more of a 30-year mortgage type interest?
I think the picture will tell that story for you, Mike.
Thank you.
So the top half of this chart shows what municipal debt should look like, which is declining. Municipal debt is, per best practice, you're paying more in year 1 than you are in year 15 or 20 or 25. You want to do equal principal payment. That's the ideal way to structure your debt, in which case you'd have much larger interest payments up front, and they would decline rapidly and be gone at the end. Instead, if you were to trace, do we have a laser on here? We do. So right here, if you follow this rectangle all the way back, right? So of the $6 million in debt service that we have, this bottom piece here that goes out to 2040, Ronnie's looking now, but that would be one of the schools. There's also there's a drop here that's masked a little bit by the rest of this triangle. That would probably be the second school. So you're looking at about $4 million stacked through 2037, and then a little under $2 million stacked out to 2040. And when you structure municipal debt like a mortgage, where your first payment is the same amount as your last payment, you're paying a lot more interest, but you're keeping your costs constant and predictable. The challenge will be for the town meeting of 2040, because even if none of us who are sitting in the room today are sitting in these seats in 2040, the town will have debt obligations and projects that it would like to do, but the first quarter of the debt budget is going to be tied up from a project that was completed 25 years prior. So that's where the challenge lies, and that's why when rating agencies are looking at a town or city's debt load, they want to see that you're aggressively retiring, I think it's 60% in the first 10 years. They want to see that you're retiring 60% of your existing debt in the first 10 years of your debt cycle, because that shows them that it's being retired rapidly and in a declining manner, which frees up future debt capacity. So we're below that mark. We're not in a danger zone, but we are not at 60% at this point.
And what percentage of our debt could be refinanced at some point in the near future to be able to change that?
Probably zero at this point, for two reasons. One, towns and cities during the historically low period were refinancing like crazy, so a lot of lending institutions started putting a 10-year more, there were steep penalties for trying to refi during the first 10 years. That chilled the ability, and given the interest rate environment right now, we're not going to beat the rates that we have in the book. So we do meet annually to look at our existing debt, and Ronnie's going to correct something that I just said.
I'm not going to correct any.
Go ahead, Rodney, we can't wait.
Dare you, right? I would say that in 2021, we did do a refinancing. You may recall it saved us about $6.3 million over the life of the bond. And Hilltop, our agent, brings us any opportunity that, but as the manager mentioned, those opportunities are going to be few and far between in the near future.
Anything else?
That's it?
Aaron?
No questions.
So if I look at the schedule, it looks like next year we have about $750,000 of debt going bon voyage. Looking at the middle school maturities and the school roof maturity. Is that right? On
Sounds
page
right.
84.
Yeah, so in FY '26, we'll make a final payment.
Yeah.
So FY '27, we'll have capacity, correct?
Yeah. And what informs the red on the additional debt? Basically expectations about public works, things like that, or?
No, when we put together the debt projections every year, we always add $1 million in there for unknowns. A good example of that, I think it was the Rivers.
Highlands.
The Highlands roof 3 or 4 years ago. That ended up being a $4 million project, more or less. But because we hadn't used that million in capacity for a couple of years, we were able to roll that in. So we just assumed there's gonna be some small project that nobody's thinking of that we're gonna end up having to take on.
Okay.
But what's not reflected in there would be, for example, the DPW. If we were to do a DPW project, which could have a price tag, and I'm making these numbers up, $25 to $50 million, that would change the contours of this.
Okay, that's it.
Paul?
Well, I think you answered the question I was going to ask. The DPW project. The land that you just talked about for that project, aside from the debt, which would be fairly large, I mean, the building would be expensive. You said 25 to 50. You're talking about the whole DPW department, which is here on Hobart Street?
So there was a placeholder in the capital budget that's been there for probably 15 years, which was just called Consolidated DPW Facility. And in a perfect world, we'd love to put all of the divisions under one roof. We spent about 1.5 years looking, and there were no sites that sort of jumped off the page. So the other option is looking at, I think right now we're spread across 4 different properties. Hobart Street, Borough Street, Canal Street, and North Putnam Street. We also have the buildings division in a block building down in Plains Park. So if we can't get everybody under one roof, the question is if we were gonna make investment and improvements to one of the existing sites and then put a second site at the power plant property, what would be the most cost-effective way to do that? Which divisions naturally would fit well together? What's the best way to structure that in terms of cost? Where would you put the garage? Where would you put the salt shed? Those sorts of things. But that's where, and we could, when David Lane is here, we can have a deeper conversation about some of that work. I mean, we've done some feasibility work on that. But that property is one that would not be large enough to house everybody, in part because there are some ag restrictions on that property. There are some farmers who are using the back side of that property, and the state has indicated that those leases aren't going anywhere. So that does limit the footprint of that property. We don't think the price on that property will be exorbitant, in part because it's part of the state's disposition system and the municipalities come first, so they're required by law to go through an appraisal process, at which we can accept or whatnot. But we're still several steps down the road, Paul, from
That property
answering
is
those questions.
adjacent to the Hawthorne Post Office? Is that where it is?
It's in that, I don't know if it's adjacent, but it's behind it, yeah.
Yeah, that's, okay. I just want to make sure it was in the right spot. Yeah.
So we're the only, we have the only access to that property off Maple Street, otherwise it's accessed from the road leading up, I believe, to the housing.
I think the other thing too is that at least from what I've been told, when we've looked at this from the electric light board, there's sort of two problems from the electric light division standpoint. One is that the Borough Street property is just completely inadequate to be able to deal with storage and a whole bunch of other things because of flooding. That's a positive, I think, in terms of this project, because obviously a portion of the bonding and the construction costs could be apportioned to electric and probably to a lesser extent water, probably, so.
Would there be probably much too early, but just curiosity-wise, would it be possible, or is it too early to tell whether both boroughs and the electric, and would they be moved out?
Yeah, I think, part of if this project starts to gain momentum, I think one of the early conversations we'd want to have first with the select board and then with town meeting is, once we've identified which sites will accommodate the divisions best, what's the appetite for dispossessing of some of those properties that are left behind? Because it isn't gonna, there may be other reasons, but from a budget perspective, it doesn't make sense to hang on to properties that aren't being used, especially when those properties, the proceeds of those properties could be reinvested into the project and bring down the debt costs associated with it. But that's really a conversation that would start at the select board and then make its way through the process.
The present site on Hobart Street, that is zoned for that particular, I'm sure it's zoned for you're gonna build homes, correct?
Well, it's a former landfill, so
Yeah, the likelihood
So,
of being able.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah.
That wasn't illegal.
That's probably the
I think
building,
I
that's
think
the other building
Hobart
we'd
Street
keep.
site would-
I think we're stuck with that property.
I think
Yeah.
we're gonna, and that would be
Yeah.
utilized, it's got a lot of stuff there that we would not
Over the
wanna get
years,
rid of.
that was gonna be my question.
I think you're
How would you
asking the-
clean it up if you were?
We wouldn't, we'd keep
I
it.
don't think that
Yeah.
juice wouldn't be worth
Unless
the
you want to buy it.
Keep it dirty.
Hey, I'm buying property all over the place. No, thanks. Okay, I'm done. I'm all set. Thank you.
Eric?
No, I just appreciate my colleagues asking the questions that I would have asked, and then the town manager answering the question I was going to get to, which is disposition, generate some revenue on the other side of that. So whenever that conversation comes up, I appreciate the thoughts are already out there, so.
Arthur?
Move the budget.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Next is the Danvers Retirement System, and I'm going to turn it over to Rodney, who is the Select Board appointee to the Retirement Board. Take this one on with no notice.
Good luck.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to read these bullets now. We are 56.2% funded as of our last valuation date. As the manager mentioned in the beginning, we're on a funding schedule that has us going up roughly 8% per year to fully fund the liability by 2035. Our assumed rate of return is 7.125%. We had a strong calendar year 23 with a 17.3% return. Happy to answer any questions.
Arthur? I'm good. Eric?
Nothing.
Paul?
All set.
Ted?
So, once we get to that date in 2035, what's the expected increase in contribution every year after that? Right now, you're guiding us to 8% a year, right?
Yeah, so at that point, it becomes just the normal cost. So the annual actual payments checks out the door to current retirees. The liability will be resolved. So it'll actually be, I think the last time we calculated, it was about $14 million worth of savings annually by having the liability fully wiped out.
But to answer the next question, which you haven't asked yet, at that point, what the select board voted on as part of their financial policies is a commitment to redirect the funding that was going to buy down the pension liability to direct that toward the OPEB liability, which is far and away our largest liability on the books. So we don't have there is no funding, state mandated funding plan for retiree health care the way that there is for pension. But what a lot of towns and cities are doing are committing to using the budget resources once they're available to start to chip away at that other liability.
No questions.
Mike?
So I had the pleasure last night of sitting through the entirety of the Marblehead Finance Committee meeting, because I had a client that had a thing on Article 41. And it was interesting because they obviously, I can't even explain how messed up such a system is over there, but that's neither here nor there. But they actually made the decision to not fund OPEB this year in order to be able to utilize that money to deal with what they saw as a shortfall in the school budget. We would never do that, I'm obviously but I guess the question is, because it might be raised, is when we talk about, I know OPEB is in a different spot, but are we just doing what we're required to by the state, or do we give a little bit more in this case to?
So OPEB is tricky. Pension is easy because PIRAC it's a defined benefit plan. So you know that, your last 5 years, your best 5 years, depending on years of service, there's an actuary table that's going to tell you what your pension benefit is. You can plan that cost out. The OPEB liability is built on a whole bunch of assumptions being made about the cost of prescription drugs and medical services 15, 20 years into the future. They're making broad assumptions about rates of return on the projected liability. And any number of things could radically change those liabilities. For example, we saw $50 million swings in our liability based on the prime bond rate, right? When the economy is good, our liability grows. When the rate goes up, our liability shrinks because there's an inverse relationship there. I think most importantly, if the federal government were to make a sweeping regulatory change to the way that healthcare in the United States operates, that would have a profound impact on OPEB liabilities for every town and city in the country. So I'm not aware of any states that have come in and mandated certain funding schedules for that. At this point, it's a known liability, and based on the assumptions today, the expectation from the rating agencies and the auditors is that you're doing something. And I think Danvers is ahead of the game in terms of the commitment that was made, I believe in 2006, when they created a stabilization fund for OPEB, and then we converted that to a trust in 2016. So we have more assets being invested right now than many communities. We're trailing well behind others. But what we've shown the rating agencies and the auditors is that we have a plan. It's a plan we came up with, where we're increasing that contribution each year. And then there's a commitment in a decade to considerably increasing it. But again, a lot of things could change between now and 2036.
I guess my question always with OPEB has been, do we do what we do just because the bond rating entities want us to do it, but we don't have any idea what, if anything that we're doing will actually have a positive and or negative effect of what happens in 10 years?
I would say that's a cynical view, but it's not a crazy view. I would also say one of the advantages, the way that the trust is set up is that eligible uses of the trust funds are retiree health care. So any year that we wanted to start drawing those funds down to offset ongoing costs, we could do that. So it's not it's an investment, right? It's available to us when we need it, but it's also something we can point to show that we're taking that liability seriously, which again communicates to the lending world that we're not flying by the seat of our pants.
It was just, I mean, the only reason I'm saying that is that I'm listening what went on last night at that meeting, and yet they still are a AAA rated community. And I'm like, how were we never not a AAA community at one point, I guess is
There's
what I
one
was
simple
thinking.
answer, Mike, and that's per capita income.
Yeah, I understand.
We don't have a harbor.
We don't have a neck.
Yeah.
We got Sandy Beach.
Can I ask one more question? So, if you assume that the budget grows about 3% every year, we're planning for this to grow 8% every single year for 10 more years, right? Is that correct? So every year, it's going to outpace it's roughly gonna outpace our our levy growth by about 5%.
This is
For
the
10
answer
more
right
years.
here,
So every year when we reset the clock, we're sort of in $500,000. We have to find $500,000 of either growth or savings from other budgets to accommodate what we plan to do here, every single year.
There's a lot of vigorous head shaking going on right there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Not to want to be Marblehead, but do we have the ability, I would think the answer might be yes, at some point, if we had to adjust in that particular way because of some unforeseen budget problem, would we have the ability to, let's say, cut back a little of our OPEB?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I just want to separate the two, because right now we're talking about the pension assessment.
Okay.
The pension actuarial evaluation and funding amounts are determined by the Danvers retirement system, so we don't theoretically have control, other than I have a seat at the table. But
Yeah.
in terms of OPEB, if we wanted to 1 year turn off the spigot and not fund it, I think,
So
again, the
there's
rating
that-
agencies may not look favorably on it. So this, again,
Oh,
we
yeah.
would be able to, there's a potential it would affect our bond rating. I think if we decided to instead use our actual investment returns to fund retiree health insurance, we would get downgraded.
Really? Thank you.
Interesting. Wally? Bill? Is there a motion?
Move the budget.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Next is the benefits and insurance budget, and a couple of points to be made here. First, I mentioned at the beginning, the town of Danvers renewal on its health plan this year is 4.57%. Viewed through one lens, that's almost double Prop 2.5, which is not a sustainable budget number for the town. But through another lens, the GIC, which is the state healthcare consortium, saw increases this year of 9 to 11% in their renewals. And the average for Maya communities was 6.6%, I believe. So at 4.57%, we're below trend. I mean, the healthcare costs have snapped back to where they were pre-pandemic. Not surprising, the hospitals are now wanting to be made whole for the losses that they incurred. And when the hospitals want to be made whole, that's done through the insurance industry. And when the insurance industry wants to protect its profit margin, its employers, i.e. the town of Danvers and other organizations that end up making up that cost. So it's a good number. I think we should be happy that we, and I credit to the unions and the process that we went through with them 4 or 5 years ago, where we spent about 2 years putting a high deductible plan on the table. We still have a far higher participation rate in our deductible plan than a lot of communities see. And I chalk that up to the education that was done at the table with our unions, and then the conversations that they had, and certainly the conversations that our HR team has had with employees every year about the different options they have. So the renewal's 4.57%. You'll note that the employee insurance line is only up 3.54%. And that is because we have pulled back a considerable amount of the carry that we have in that account. And the reason that there's carry in that account is that we're making best guesses at the beginning of every fiscal year, who's going to be using what plans, what life events may occur. We have lots of data to help us make those projections. But if we hire 12 employees next year who want to be on the family plan, and they're replacing 12 employees who are either not taking health insurance or were on the individual plan, we have to pay for that. Right. And that's a risk that we're taking on by reducing that margin. But it's one of the ways that we were able to get the budget balance this year. We're also putting less into our workers' comp and unemployment funds. We're comfortable doing that based on trend, but that's another area where you never know what's around the corner. We could have an injury tomorrow that would start drawing down that fund. We're comfortable with where we are, but I wanted to flag both of those things as part of this discussion. And I should have noted at the top, we're on page 85 in the budget book, and we'd be happy to take questions.
Wally? Mike?
So I guess, just so I can sort of understand it exactly, so basically what you're saying is that that if we looked at what insurance plans in and of themselves, sort of separate from the total number of employees we have, that's that 4.57 increase. But because basically we have fewer employees taking that plan, in a way, is why we get it down to the 3.54?
No, the total renewal that we have, is based on the employees who are on the plan today.
Yeah.
But we historically carry more in the employee insurance line than the exact dollar amount that we're projecting. Because other things that we carry in that, the town has a health insurance opt-out program that it put in place 4 or 5 years ago. We have an HSA contribution that we make for employees who join the deductible plan. So we fund that, we partially fund that for the first 2 years. So we carry some funds in there for those. We also, again, historically will carry funds if we have a new employee replacing, if there's et cetera. So what we did, there's a cushion there, right? So we know what our projected cost is. We try to carry a little more than that for the unforeseen. We've pulled back on that number this year, which is that's the difference between the 457 and the 354.
No questions.
Call?
No questions.
So I do have a question, and that is not so much the budget, but our vacancy rate and our competitiveness to attract employees, because obviously this is this is the worm on the hook, so to speak. And it has been a very difficult labor market, so I'm interested in how are we doing if this is what we're putting on the table?
So there's a lot to that question. Our vacancy rates are on par with everybody else's in terms of, we're seeing, as you alluded to, it remains a competitive recruitment market. We're getting closer to full staff in a number of departments where we've been down. The town offers an 80% employer match. That's, average. Some are more, some, no.
Employer contribution, not that.
Thank you. 70%, I'm sorry. Again, it's been a long week. We're 70-30. Some towns fund 80%, some towns fund 90%. There are a few towns doing that. So we're average in terms of how much of the health insurance. I'm imagining the unions that are watching tonight and saying, oh, did they just increase the contribution? So we're 70-30.
Sure they're all watching.
So the basket of benefits that we offer in the public sector, they do vary slightly from town to town. Normally, when we see people moving around municipalities, it's not necessarily the healthcare contribution unless that person has very specific and particular healthcare needs. We got a lot of employees coming out of the pandemic who were living in our orbit but working far afield and had decided at that point they really wanted to work closer to home. We lost employees for the same reason. The biggest challenge we have, private to public, in a good economy is people who are not focused on retirement but are focused only on hourly rate will go, especially in the DPW department, when the pay is good and the economy is good, they'll go work private sector, and then when the economy slags, that's when people start coming back to the public sector. We're more stable. But in terms of how competitive we are, I think we're looking at pay ranges, we're looking at benefits packages, we're looking at everything, and there's not a ton of deviation from town to town, city to city.
That's helpful, thank you.
Arthur? All set? Is there a motion?
Move the budget.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Great, thank you. And that's it for this evening. We return Wednesday for probably a much longer evening.
Who do we want to do that isn't here?
Well,
Let's do the fire department.
You can't help yourself. I do want to take umbrage at the fact that Bill Bradstreet chose the planning board over us tonight, and.
But he already heard this presentation.
Thank you for coming, Bill.
Yeah, thank you for being the one.
Well, Bill Bradstreet did sit through the 9-hour budget hearing with select board, so he's heard all this already.
Yeah, but we do it so much better.
That doesn't necessarily stop him.
Adjourn, or are we all right?
I think we're okay.
All right. I can't believe it.
You want a motion to adjourn?
What do they get today? Is there a fire in there?
I remember sitting here, you were